Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. As Bai Xiaochun stood there, smiling enigmatically at the diva, no one even thought to consider who he was. Not a single person realized that he was one of the 5 celestials of the Saint Emperor dynasty. Bai Xiaochun suddenly realized that keeping a low profile was great, and in some ways, was better than doing things the normal way. No wonder a lot of big shots like to secretly mingle with the common people. It's a really wonderful feeling. It was truly nice to be in a situation like this in which he faced absolutely no danger. When the diva saw his seemingly pleased smile, and heard his words, he suddenly got a very strange feeling. However, he didn't pay too much attention to that feeling. This shady character is trying to sneak into the capital city, the diva announced. Arrest him for further inspection. If he checks out, send him on his way, and if he resists, execute him on the spot. The crowd began to back up even further. Some of them were looking at Bai Xiaochun sympathetically, but more had looks of open scorn. Is this guy an idiot, or what? Who would dare to make a scene right here? Why would he do this? That's Marquis Zilin. All he has to do is step to the side. It's not like they asked him to cut his own arm off or something. He's finished. Nowadays, anybody who gets arrested like this ends up getting thrown in prison and never coming out again. Cold gleams appeared in the eyes of the guards, all of whom, with the exception of the one who had already been stunned into immobility by Bai Xiaochun, hurried forward. Bai Xiaochun actually hadn't expected the diva to just immediately have him arrested. A strange expression appeared on his face as he sighed. What's the point of all this? I just wanted to get into the city. And I was trying to keep a low profile. Shaking his head, he waved his hand. He didn't reveal his celestial cultivation base, he just used some nascent soul level power, 1 level above these core formation guards. A windstorm sprang up, pushing the guards so hard that they were shoved back across the ground. One of them even coughed up some blood. What gall? The diva shouted. Get on your knees immediately. Blurring into motion, he shot forward, fueling his hand with a burst of diva power to slap Bai Xiaochun. In the diva's mind, this blow would probably not be deadly, but it would at least force this person onto his knees. Derision filled his heart. If this person had simply backed down, he would have just been punished a bit. But since he decided to resist, then it meant he was foolishly asking to be killed. Therefore, the diva's actions were all in accord with the strict laws of the capital city. However, even as the diva's hand began to move, Bai Xiaochun sighed and sent his right hand flying toward him. How about you kneel instead? Even as the words left his mouth, a smacking sound filled the air. The diva's vision swam as a massive, unavoidable force hit him. His mind went blank, and he was nearly deafened. Blood then sprayed out of his mouth as he was smacked out of the air to land hard on the ground, right in front of Bai Xiaochun, his knees shattered, and blood oozing out all over him. The intense pain he felt prompted a hoarse scream. He wanted to stand up, but his broken knees wouldn't permit it. Worse, his cultivation base was teetering on the point of collapse. Everyone in the crowd was stunned, and many a gasp could be heard. Fine, you're not a nascent soul cultivator, the diva cried. But even if you are a diva, you're still dead. Trying to ignore the intense pain, he pulled out a jade slip, which he crushed. Of course, that jade slip acted like an alarm trigger, and instantly caused numerous beams of light to rise up from within the city and head toward the main gate. Bai Xiaochun was a bit at a loss as to what to do. He had just wanted to enter the city, but had already caused quite a scene. Shaking his head, he turned and prepared to pass through the shield and enter the gate. However, before he could move, Marquis Zilin, who had been standing off to the side completely silently up to this point, finally spoke. Stop him. Immediately, his subordinates rushed forth with coldly gleaming eyes. 5 devas and more than 10 nascent soul cultivators all stepped forward, giving rise to shocking energy. For many of the onlookers, this was an incredible scene the likes of which they would rarely be able to see. What a pity you didn't reveal your diva cultivation base earlier, Marquis Zilin continued. Clearly you're trying to show off. Finished? My subordinates have all grown up on the battlefield. Each of them have killed more than 10,000 enemies. As some in the crowd sighed about what was surely to come, Bai Xiaochun's anger flared. After all, he hadn't caused any trouble for this Marquis Zilin. Yet despite that, the man was clearly singling him out. Think you can bully me? Bai Xiaochun said, glaring. He waved his right hand, allowing the power of the great circle of the diva realm to sweep out across the incoming subordinates of Marquis Zilin. Immediately, their hearts filled with wild shock. Deafening rumbling sounds filled their ears, and their vision swam as a mountain-toppling, sea-draining force assailed them. There was literally nothing they could do to defend themselves. The 5 devas in the lead position coughed up mouthfuls of blood as they were forced to the ground in a kneeling position. As for the 10 nascent soul cultivators, they were even less able to resist. As they slammed into the ground, blood-curdling screams echoed out in all directions. It all happened in the blink of an eye, much to the shock of the onlookers. It was almost unthinkable to see so many powerful cultivators kneeling, right there at the main gate to the city. How amusing, Marquis Zilin said, his eyes sparkling, and a slight smile of derision appearing on his face. He strode forward, moving so quickly that a massive wind kicked up. Arriving in front of Bai Xiaochun, he unleashed an energy far more terrifying than what Bai Xiaochun had just unleashed. This was not the early demigod realm, it was the power of the Great Circle. However, Bai Xiaochun's expression remained the same as ever as he reached out with his right hand and casually waved his hand toward Marquis Zilin. "You kneel too," he said coolly. His hand became something like an all-destructive mountain that could crush everything. Marquis Zilin seemed like he had been moving quickly, but to Bai Xiaochun, it was nothing more than a snail's pace. As for the wind he had kicked up, it felt like the breath of a child, and the massive force that caused the air to ripple was so weak he could dispel it with ease. That was the difference between demigods and celestials, and showed how vastly superior a Deoseed was. Rumbling sounds echoed out as Bai Xiaochun's palm hit, not the Marquis Zilin there in front of him, but something obscured behind him. The air rippled and distorted as a second Marquis Zilin stumbled out. That was how Marquis Zilin operated. When he appeared in public, he would keep his true self hidden, and have a clone act openly. Of course, demigods in the Heavenspan realm couldn't normally create clones, and it was the same for demigods in the eternal immortal domains, which made this strategy particularly effective, and also rare. Just now, he had sent his clone over to test Bai Xiaochun a bit. Never could he have imagined that his test would be crushed as if by a mountain. The buzz of conversation rose up as both Marquis Zilin and his clone had their cultivation bases nearly destroyed. The intense force he could now sense caused him to tremble, and his eyes to shine with disbelief. He wanted to ask this person who he was, but before he could, the energy slammed into him, forcing him down. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as well as his clone's mouth as both of them were slammed into the ground. Thud! Dust billowed out as the audience looked on, stunned. Marquis Zilin's subordinates were in a daze, but even more shocked was the diva in charge of this gate. Waves of shock battered him as he realized that there was only one explanation for this, as unbelievable as it seemed. As soon as the idea entered his head, it nearly drove him mad. Celestial, just outside of one of the main gates of the capital city. Everyone stood dumbstruck, unable to believe their eyes. There Bai Xiaochun stood, looking like some kind of divine spirit, causing everyone to forget to breathe. It had been shocking enough to see his one palm knock several nascent soul guards down only moments ago. At that point, they had assumed that he was some wandering master. Then another palm forced the diva expert to kneel, causing them to gasp with the realization that this young man was actually a powerful expert. Subsequently, another palm forced 5 devas and a host of nascent soul experts to kneel, and the crowd was flabbergasted. At that point, they had assumed that Bai Xiaochun was a demigod. Never could they have imagined that he was actually a celestial. After all, celestials were not a common thing. In all of the eternal immortal domains, there were only 12. More shockingly, this person only needed one palm to deal with Marquis Zilin's attack. The sight of Marquis Zilin and all of the other powerful experts kneeling in front of the city gate caused the onlookers' minds to simmer on the verge of exploding. They felt like they were being struck by a million lightning bolts, until their minds went blank. None of them dared to even think. What was happening right in front of them was so profoundly shocking that they would never forget it for the rest of their lives. At this point, the diva in charge of the gate muttered something, tearful words spoken as if in the ultimate despair. Because of the deathly silence that filled the air, his muttered words echoed like thunder into the ears of the already stunned audience, causing many of them to gasp. Celestial. It took only a moment for the silence to be broken, replaced by a massive commotion. How is this even possible? Am I dreaming? Is this a hallucination? Am I actually looking at a celestial? The gathered group of kneeling cultivators were all trembling, and some of the weaker ones, those in core formation, were so terrified that they simply passed out. Marquis Zilin's subordinates were so terrified their faces were as white as sheets, and they were soaked with sweat. Merely being looked at by Bai Xiaochun filled them with unprecedented levels of terror and infinite regret. He's a celestial. Damn it, if he's a celestial, why didn't he say so earlier? Why'd he have to do it this way? They all felt like they were about to go mad. However, the one who was taking it worst of all was Marquis Zilin. His face was currently so red it was turning magenta, and the bitterness he felt in his heart knew no end. Perhaps some in the audience were still unconvinced, and believed Bai Xiaochun to simply be in the great circle of the demigod realm. But having actually been struck by Bai Xiaochun's palm, Marquis Zilin was absolutely certain what level of cultivation base he was dealing with. Only a celestial would be able to so easily deal with a group of nascent soul cultivators, devas and demigods. With one casual move, he forced all of them to kneel before him on the ground. Now that he knew the level of Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base, he didn't even need to put any thought into the matter to figure out who he was. After all, it had only been a few months since the Saint Emperor appointed King Heavenspan, Bai Xiaochun, as the second celestial to be stationed in the second immortal domain. Furthermore, Marquis Zilin had personally seen all of the other celestials in the Saint Emperor dynasty. Bai Xiaochun was the only one he had never laid eyes on. After putting all of the pieces of the puzzle together, Marquis Zilin's heart nearly shattered. He felt like he had just swallowed a whole cupful of bile, making him as bitter could be, inside and out. Smiling bitterly, he gritted his teeth and, being unable to feel or move his legs, clasped hands and said, "I, Zilin, offer greetings, King Heavenspan." As soon as the words left his mouth, the babbling of the crowd ceased. All eyes turned to fall on Bai Xiaochun. Silence prevailed for a short moment, and then the hubbub began again. King Heavenspan? He's Bai Xiaochun, the 11th celestial. Bai Xiaochun from the Heavenspan realm. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun stood there looking at the people all lined up and kneeling in front of him. Inside, he sighed, thinking about how he really had a lot of progress to make in keeping a low profile. But these people just had to go and refuse him entry. If that had been all there was to the matter, he might have been able to accept it. But then they attacked him. That was what got him really angry. It was no surprise to him to hear Marquis Zilin saying his name out loud. In fact, Bai Xiaochun would have found it odd if the man didn't finally realize who he was. Glaring at the man, he said, "So, you do know who I am. And you attacked me anyway? Well, you've certainly got some guts, don't you, Marquis Zilin?" It was all thanks to this Marquis Zilin that his plan of keeping a low profile had been completely ruined. If only he had come a bit earlier or a bit later, then none of this would have happened. "Please, quell your anger, King Heavenspan." Marquis Zilin wanted to explain things, but he knew that in this moment, all he could do was bow his head. At the same time, hatred for Bai Xiaochun took root in his heart, although he didn't dare to reveal that. "You celestials," he thought, "always toying with people like me." Although Marquis Zilin felt profoundly unlucky, the diva responsible for this gate felt even more unlucky. To him, it was like the entire world had been turned upside down, and all he could do was stare pleadingly at Bai Xiaochun. It was at around this time that the people in the city who had received the distress messages approached. Before they even arrived, their voices rang out by the city gate. "Who is it that wishes to die? How dare you try to invade the capital city? What outrageous gall! Get on your knees immediately." There were 8 in total, 5 men and 3 women, all of whom were in the great circle of the diva realm. When they saw the host of people kneeling on the ground, their anger burned, but soon they noticed that one of those people was Marquis Zilin. At that point, they each felt like a bucket of cold water had been poured on their heads. They began to tremble, and immediately lurched to a halt and backed up a bit. Eventually, they caught sight of Bai Xiaochun, whereupon the shock in their eyes grew greater. Frowning, Bai Xiaochun looked up at the 8 new arrivals, and tried to decide whether or not to drag them down and make them kneel too. Even as he pondered what to do, the 8 devas shot backward, and simultaneously pulled out and crushed jade slips. Subsequently, a massive, majestic divine sense swept out from the city. It was like a tempest that could shake the heavens and topple the earth, that could crush anything and everything in the area. It made the devas seem like ants, and the demigods like dogs. All of the cultivators in the capital city were shaken to the core, and began to tremble as their cultivation bases were suppressed. It was the same with everyone at the gate, including Marquis Zilin, who began to shake visibly. As a direct descendant of celestial aged spirit, how could Marquis Zilin not recognize this divine sense? As for everyone else, it wasn't difficult for them to guess its origin. In the capital city, there was only one person on this level. The entire world shook as everyone bowed their heads. However, Bai Xiaochun stood apart. He simply looked into the capital city, toward the source of the divine sense. Clearly, the person who had sent it out was not happy. Sighing, Bai Xiaochun said, "Well met, fellow Taoist aged spirit." 10 breaths of time passed. Finally, a cold voice echoed out into heaven and earth. Your way of making an entrance is quite out of the norm, fellow Taoist Bai. Men, go escort King Heavenspan, Bai Xiaochun, into the city. Each of celestial aged spirits' words echoed like heavenly thunder, shaking the entire city. And in response, several beams of light shot up into the air. Within those beams were 10 demigod experts stationed in the capital city, and all of them shot directly toward the city gate. 10 demigods who served under celestial aged spirit here in the capital city arrived in beams of bright light. 7 were men and 3 were women, and they were a variety of ages. One was a beautiful woman. They all had somber expressions as they looked at Bai Xiaochun. Ignoring Marquis Lin and the other kneeling cultivators, they clasped hands and bowed deeply to Bai Xiaochun. Greetings, King Heavenspan. Many gasps could be heard in the stunned crowd. What was happening right in front of their own eyes seemed completely unbelievable. As for Bai Xiaochun, he sighed in his heart. He was no longer the puny cultivator he had been back when he first stepped into the cultivation world. He was a celestial, and although he couldn't actually read people's thoughts, it was easy for him to guess what they were thinking. Although these 10 demigods were acting with respect, from the way they addressed him, it was easy to judge their attitude. They were welcoming him to the city out of formality, but didn't really want him there. Moments later, a large number of devas approached, as well as tens of thousands of ordinary guards. As they formed ranks outside the main gate, the sound of tolling bells filled the city. Then, cultivators clustered around him to escort him inside. Marquis Lin never rose to his feet the entire time. Although people like him weren't necessarily required to follow the orders of someone like Bai Xiaochun, in his presence, they had to act with utmost respect. Considering that Bai Xiaochun had personally punished him, no one would possibly show him any goodwill right now. After all, no one wanted to share in his punishment. And thus, it was with a show of great pomp, and yet with little passion, that Bai Xiaochun was received into the city. Everyone was shaken as he was led to a location in the city center, where an extremely luxurious mansion sat. It covered an area of at least 30,000 meters, and rose high into the sky. Its grounds contained ornamental rocks, deep pools of water, and small streams with bridges over them. Verandas existed everywhere. Intense pressure filled the entire mansion, as well as strong spiritual energy. There were also spell formations which would extract the earth string energy from the second immortal domain. All in all, this place was a wonder. There were more than 1,000 menservants and maidservants lined up outside the entrance, who were tasked with caring for Bai Xiaochun's daily needs. Of course, all of the men were very handsome, and the women were beautiful. Any one of them could be described as extraordinary. Bai Xiaochun couldn't find a single thing wrong with any of it. There were only 2 mansions like this within the capital city. One of them was his, and the other had even more abundant spiritual energy. It was the home of the person who oversaw all of the second immortal domain, celestial aged spirit. The 2 mansions weren't very far apart, in fact, they were within eyesight of each other. All of the important cultivators from the city were very polite. After escorting Bai Xiaochun to his mansion, they bid him farewell. The entire time, celestial aged spirit didn't show up. Toward the end, he simply sent a greeting via divine sense. That made it more than obvious to Bai Xiaochun that the man wasn't very pleased with his presence. After all, the second immortal domain had once been home to only 1 celestial, but now, 2 were present. That meant that it would be difficult to avoid power struggles and conflicts. Because of how many years celestial aged spirit had been in charge of the second immortal domain, it was safe to assume that all of the devas and demigods worked for him. In some ways, this wasn't the second immortal domain of the Saint Emperor dynasty, it was celestial aged spirit's personal fiefdom. Furthermore, it didn't matter that Bai Xiaochun had a similar rank and title to celestial aged spirit, he was a foreigner. Therefore, if he caused disasters here like he had in Saint Emperor City, whether it was intentional or not, celestial aged spirit would definitely not stand for it. Whatever. I wanted to keep a low profile, right? I was living under someone else's roof before, and now I don't really have much authority. Although I'm not really in charge of anything, I doubt anybody will cause any problems for me. Sighing, he thought about it, and decided that he was duty-bound to not cause any conflicts here in the second immortal domain. He would keep to himself and work on his cultivation. Sooner or later, I'll get my chance to kill you a second time, Taoist Heavenspan. That was the second reason he was so interested in furthering his cultivation, the first being to give the Heavenspan cultivators a choice about their future. Having made his decision, he settled down quietly in his mansion. Although the mansion was large, there were 1,000 servants there to tend to it, so it didn't seem depressingly empty. Before long, half a month had gone by. During that time, virtually no one came to visit him, and Celestial Aged Spirit didn't send any messages. It was almost as if no one was even paying attention to his existence. Normally, the 10 demigods would tend to day-to-day matters in the second immortal domain, and then compile reports for Celestial Aged Spirit, which he would use to provide further direction. Bai Xiaochun didn't pay any attention to that. He remained in a private chamber, practicing cultivation with the command medallion from the damaged fan. The cultivators in the capital city had originally assumed they were in for a big commotion. But eventually, they realized that didn't seem likely. Obviously, this newly arrived King Heavenspan was deferring to Celestial Aged Spirit. That attitude earned Bai Xiaochun a bit of benefit. All he had to do was ask for something, and virtually anyone in the capital city would do everything possible to comply with his request. For the cultivators in the second immortal domain, life seemed exactly the same as before Bai Xiaochun had arrived. He remained happily in seclusion, using the command medallion to advance his cultivation. He also had access to large numbers of immortal pills and spirit plants that helped his cultivation base. In addition, he spent time researching flame conjuring techniques again. He hoped to find something in the eternal immortal domains that could be used as a substitute for souls, and as it turned out, that wasn't very difficult. The eternal immortal domains had a complete cycle of reincarnation that made it difficult to get access to souls. However, there were other things which could be used instead. For example, there were combustible soul stones. Although they were somewhat rare, they could be altered to create multicolored flame. Actually, Bai Xiaochun wasn't the only one to have come to this conclusion. There were other wildlander necromancers in the eternal immortal domains who had figured out the same trick. Even spirit enhancers like Big Fatty Zhang had come to use similar techniques. One upside to this method was that it made performing spirit enhancements easier. However, there was also a downside. After a 7-fold or 8-fold spirit enhancement, it was virtually impossible to find the necessary multicolored flame. Even back in the days of the Wildlands, it was possible to see how spirit enhancement and necromancy were connected, and now that fact was even more obvious. What a pity, there just aren't enough souls. Bai Xiaochun shook his head as he looked down at Bai Hao's spark-shaped scar on the back of his hand. Bai Hao was still sleeping, and Bai Xiaochun was slowly coming to the conclusion that it was only by means of flame conjuring that he could wake him. It wasn't possible to create high-level multicolored flame, but he did create plenty of 8-fold enhanced magical items and medicinal pills. He even refined the Greatsword of the North. He didn't have much free time. Before long, 3 months had gone by. One day when he was practicing cultivation with the command medallion, he suddenly heard the sound of bells ringing in the capital city. There was an urgency to how they rang, and they instantly caused a commotion in the city. Somewhat taken aback, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes and left his private chamber. Almost immediately, one of his servants ran over, looking very alarmed. Clasping hands and bowing, he said, "Exalted One, only an hour ago, Celestial Ghost Mother from the Vile Emperor dynasty led an army to attack the last northernmost prefecture we control. It looks like henceforth, not a single one of the 5 northern prefectures will belong to the Saint Emperor dynasty. True war is about to begin." From the way his voice trembled, it was clear how much despair he felt. "What are you so worked up for?" Bai Xiaochun barked, glaring. The servant shivered, then took a deep breath in an attempt to calm himself down. As far as Bai Xiaochun was concerned, this wasn't a big deal at all. Whether or not the Vile Emperor dynasty and the Saint Emperor dynasty went to war had nothing to do with him. Besides, it didn't seem likely to him that the 2 dynasties would actually launch a full-scale war anytime soon. If there was nothing else to worry about, perhaps they would. But the enormous sovereign visible in the sky was no mere myth. In a situation like that, why would the 2 dynasties possibly go to war with each other? Besides, 4 prefectures had already been lost in the north of the second immortal domain, so if the final northern prefecture went too, why would anyone be surprised? Perhaps it was the fact that it had been a long time since any of the prefectures in question had changed hands that had people so wound up. The truth was that his analysis of the matter was quickly proven correct. Celestial Ghost Mother simply occupied that final prefecture, and didn't make any other hostile moves, much less start a war. In fact, she didn't even kill anyone. The demigod in charge of the prefecture, as well as many of the cultivators under his command, were summarily deported to the Saint Emperor dynasty. What is Gongsun Waner doing over here? Bai Xiaochun thought. Matters of war didn't interest him, but he was definitely curious about what Gongsun Waner was up to. Whenever he thought about the fact that Ghost Mother was actually Gongsun Waner, he felt very pleased with himself. And he couldn't help but wonder how angry the vile emperor must have been to find out what had happened. Technically, Ghost Mother and Gongsun Wanner were one and the same, but not in all respects. Ghost Mother was loyal to the vile emperor, and was vicious and merciless. As for Gongsun Wanner, she was also vicious and merciless, but considering everything that had gone on, she was much more closely connected to Bai Xiaochun. Why do I feel like I've heard about this prefecture before? Bai Xiaochun thought carefully about the matter before he realized the connection, and it caused him to laugh. That was where Marquis Zilin was stationed, wasn't it? Marquis Zilin had indeed been the preceptor of the last northern prefecture. After the incident at the city gate, Bai Xiaochun had been somewhat interested in his fate. A few days after he had been forced to kneel, Celestial Aged Spirit finally ordered him to leave the capital city. From that, Bai Xiaochun could see Celestial Aged Spirit's attitude in the matter. Although it seemed like he was respecting Bai Xiaochun's feelings, that wasn't really the case. Furthermore, Marquis Zilin's hatred of Bai Xiaochun only continued to deepen. As for the demigods in the other prefectures, they joined with their compatriot in hating him. It was something that couldn't be changed easily. Bai Xiaochun was aware of all of this, and although he wasn't too happy about it, he didn't feel that it was appropriate to do anything. As far as he was concerned, he was the type of person who did monumental things. How could he possibly lower himself to the point of quibbling over minor grudges? HMPH. Back when I was a government official in the wildlands, there were some people who called me the venomous magistrate. Flicking his sleeve proudly, he ignored the matter and went back into his private chamber to continue his cultivation. After a few days of tension due to the matter of that one northern prefecture, the people in the second immortal domain seemed to accept the matter, and things calmed down. One afternoon as Bai Xiaochun was meditating in his private chamber, his transmission jade slip vibrated. After taking it out and scanning it with divine sense, his face lit up. Hurrying out of the chamber, he headed to the main entrance of his mansion, where he saw someone familiar, standing there tall and straight. It was the Giant Ghost King. Giant Ghost, old pal. Bai Xiaochun said, laughing heartily. He quickly rushed over and embraced him. He had sent a message to the Giant Ghost King as soon as he arrived in the capital city, and although the Giant Ghost King had been very happy to hear from him, he had replied that he was unable to come visit. The prefecture he presided over was quite some distance away, and considering his responsibilities there, it wasn't an easy thing to travel. Afterward, Bai Xiaochun had devoted himself to practicing cultivation with his command medallion, and hadn't paid much attention to the passage of time. He was obviously very pleased to see the Giant Ghost King, but the Giant Ghost King didn't seem to respond the same way. After a long moment of hesitation, he forced a smile onto his face. Surprisingly, he didn't correct Bai Xiaochun's form of address. After all, in the past, he would often glare at Bai Xiaochun when he called him old pal, and then remind him that he was his father-in-law. Bai Xiaochun quickly picked up on the awkwardness, but didn't say anything. Grabbing the Giant Ghost King by the arm, he dragged him into the main hall, where the two of them sat down and were served some wonderful alcohol and fruit by the servants. After shooing the servants away, Bai Xiaochun raised his cup to the Giant Ghost King and said, "Father-in-law, allow your humble son-in-law to offer a toast to your health." Hearing Bai Xiaochun address him in this way softened the Giant Ghost King's heart to some degree. After offering some good-natured cursing, he accepted, and they drank together. And thus they continued to drink and recall old times. At one point, they began to talk about the little village back in the Vile Emperor dynasty where they had reunited, and that one particular widow. Laughing, the Giant Ghost King went on to point out how, after being assigned a prefecture to manage, he was almost like an emperor himself. They drank and chatted some more, until eventually the Giant Ghost King thumped himself on the chest and said, "Let me tell you, Bai Xiaochun. Over in Godsifter Prefecture, your father-in-law is the top dog. All of the beautiful women have fallen in love with me." Bai Xiaochun rolled his eyes a bit, as if he didn't believe the Giant Ghost King. However, he didn't say anything, and just took a drink. The Giant Ghost King was not happy at this, and went on to angrily describe everything he had done in Godsifter Prefecture in very exaggerated and melodramatic fashion. Bai Xiaochun tossed in the occasional sarcastic remark, provoking quite a few scolding taunts in return. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun began to tell his stories about Saint Emperor City, starting with his fishing exploits, then moving on to the lotus seeds and then the seed pods. Finally, he finished with the lotus roots. Although the Giant Ghost King had heard the stories from afar, to hear them right out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth caused him to slap the table in amazement on numerous occasions. More than ever, he was convinced that it didn't matter where Bai Xiaochun ended up, he always became a calamitous god of calamity. They drank deep into the night, at which point they had both gone through most of their good stories. During the course of the conversation, it had become obvious to Bai Xiaochun that the giant ghost king wasn't in good shape. It was almost as if he had suffered some great blow of some sort. Lowering his voice, he quietly said, "My dear father-in-law, why don't you tell me what's going on? Is someone bullying you?" The giant ghost king didn't respond at first. He lifted his alcohol jug and swished it around to see how much was left, then downed it all. Finally, he took a deep breath and, his eyes bloodshot, viciously slapped his hand down onto the table. Complete and utter bullying. If Celestial Aged Spirit wants to imprison all of the Heavenspan cultivators he finds, so be it. I'm no match for him in a fight anyway. If he wants to completely ignore Godsifter Prefecture, so be it. He's basically hinted that I'm supposed to be isolated from the other prefectures. And every time I'm summoned for official audiences, he always berates me left and right. Fine, so be it. But that bastard has gone too far this time. That moron Marquis Zilin lost the northernmost prefecture, and instead of getting punished for it, he was sent over to my Godsifter Prefecture. Fine, so be it, but fudge, that celestial aged spirit went and appointed Marquis Zilin as the preceptor of Godsifter Prefecture. What the hell? What gives him the right to demote me from preceptor and force me to be Marquis Zilin's assistant? I put my heart and soul into running Godsifter Prefecture. I was going to make it the foundation of the new Heavenspan realm. But now all that work is for nothing. The giant ghost king chuckled bitterly, his hands clenching into fists as he told the story. Originally, he hadn't planned to tell Bai Xiaochun the news, but now that Bai Xiaochun was a celestial, he had a very strong foundation. Furthermore, in this immortal domain, he had as much authority as Celestial Aged Spirit. Bai Xiaochun would eventually hear about the matter, and the giant ghost king didn't want that to cause more problems. However, after being prompted by Bai Xiaochun, the giant ghost king couldn't keep his bitterness locked inside. After the giant ghost king finished speaking, Bai Xiaochun stood there, motionless. Not even his cup of alcohol moved an inch. However, his eyes began to shine so brightly that they seemed to catch on fire. Startled, the giant ghost king said, "Hey, don't do anything rash, Xiaochun." He already regretted telling Bai Xiaochun the truth. Bai Xiaochun shook his head, then turned to look in the direction of Celestial Aged Spirit's residence. Gradually, the fire in his eyes turned into an extremely grim expression. "If I don't do something about this, father-in-law, then you can only imagine what will happen for the people of Heavenspan in the Saint Emperor dynasty. Things will only get worse and worse. This is bullying, plain and in the open. How could I possibly turn a deaf ear to it?" When the giant ghost king saw the look in Bai Xiaochun's eyes, he suddenly got a bad feeling. Then he thought back to some of the things Bai Xiaochun had done in the past, and his heart began to pound. He definitely regretted telling him the truth. "Xiaochun, don't do anything rash. Even without Godsifter Prefecture, we still have options. I got my position from the Saint Emperor himself. There's no way that this celestial aged spirit will push things too far. He'll surely give me some compensation." Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet, slowly shaking his head. The giant ghost king anxiously moved to block his path. "Xiaochun, even if you do something, we need to think of the long-term plan. Killing celestial aged spirit won't solve anything." At this point, a strange expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face. "I never said anything about killing celestial aged spirit," he said. "That bastard works in underhanded ways, so I'm going to go embarrass him a bit, that's all. Listen, old pal, you don't need to worry about anything at all. Just rest up a bit while I head out." With that, he sidestepped the giant ghost king and left. The giant ghost king couldn't quite envision what Bai Xiaochun planned to do, and before he could decide whether or not to try to continue to persuade him to stop, he was gone. The giant ghost king stood there alone in the main hall, sighing. Finally, he stamped his foot. In the end, his cultivation base was too low to catch up to Bai Xiaochun, so therefore, he sat back down, grabbed an alcohol jug, and kept drinking. Things had been so wonderful in Godsifter Prefecture at the beginning, but now, all of that was gone. Even his ambition had taken a significant blow because of what had happened. It affected him so badly that Bai Xiaochun was able to tell that something was wrong just by looking at him. By now, Bai Xiaochun was far from the capital city, speeding northward. Considering that he was a celestial, and that he was pushing all out, there was nothing that could match him in terms of speed. Although the northern prefectures weren't very close, they also couldn't be considered to be very far away. Dawn hadn't even come by the time Bai Xiaochun caught sight of the northern part of this immortal domain. It was an icy and snowy place, incredibly cold. Snowflakes filled the air, and a bleak wind whimpered in the night air. After arriving, Bai Xiaochun scanned the area with divine sense, and then locked onto one specific area. In one particular city, in a seemingly ordinary immortals cave, Gongsun Wan'er sat cross-legged in meditation. As the celestial in charge of this northern part of the second immortal domain, she didn't actually need to be present in the north all the time. But after returning to the Vile Emperor dynasty from being kidnapped, the Vile Emperor had realized that she was slightly different than the old ghost mother, and had become slightly suspicious of her. In order to prove herself, and to solidify her position within the Vile Emperor dynasty, she had come here and taken over the 5th prefecture to prove her loyalty. Even as she sat there in meditation, her heart stirred, and her phoenix-like eyes opened. She was inherently beautiful, an effect that was even more pronounced as she looked coldly out of the corner of her eye at the entrance to her immortal's cave. For some reason, despite her beauty, she seemed profoundly icy and cold. Before long, Bai Xiaochun's voice could be heard outside. His only company as he stood outside of her immortal's cave was the gently falling snowflakes. As he looked at the entrance, he cleared his throat, not sure of what to say that would be completely appropriate. After all, he had come to ask for help. Therefore, he decided to try to play on their somewhat close relationship. "Wan'er, you know it's me. Why don't you open the door?" When she heard his words, she smiled. Although she was inclined to ignore him, she finally waved her hand, causing the entrance to swing open. He hurried in to find Gongsun Wan'er smiling at him. None of the coldness from before was present, although her eyes were as mysterious as always. "What are you doing here so late, sweetie?" she said, somewhat flirtatiously. "Don't tell me you want to spend the night with me?" Eyes flickering with a mysterious light, she gently licked her lips. "You'd let me spend the night with you?" Bai Xiaochun answered, his heart starting to pound. The truth was that if he didn't need Gongsun Wan'er's help, he would never have come to see her. Before he could say anything else though, his expression flickered, and he backed up. At the same time, Gongsun Wan'er chuckled. "You're a celestial now, sweetie. I'm very interested to see if you qualify to spend the night with me." She suddenly blurred into motion, appearing in the spot where he had just stood, her right hand flashing with an incantation gesture. A whooshing sound then rang out as the air began to distort around her, tugging the light toward her to form a vortex. "What are you doing?" Bai Xiaochun blurted. "I'm not spending the night with you." However, Gongsun Wan'er didn't even respond. Flashing a radiant smile, she closed in on him again. "Are you crazy, Gongsun Wan'er? I saved your life." Heart pounding, he dodged out of the way again, only to find her coming around for another shot. At this point, he was starting to get angry. "You psycho. We've known each other for a long time, have you forgotten? I don't have any ill intentions. I saved your life, and I'm here to ask for your help." Gongsun Wan'er's eyes glittered in response to his words. However, having discovered that he continued to dodge her, she increased her speed, becoming like a shooting star that headed toward him, her right hand extended like a claw toward his forehead. Now truly angry, Bai Xiaochun stopped evading. Performing an incantation gesture with his right hand, he imbued it with the power of his Sutra of Former Reincarnation, then struck out at her. A boom rang out as Gongsun Wan'er was struck. She yelped in shock as a host of magical symbols appeared around her, which were none other than her memories. As they rotated, it felt to her like she was being struck by lightning. Bai Xiaochun wasn't in any better shape. Her meteor-like blow seemingly stabbed through him, creating something like an invisible black hole. Instantly, he was surrounded by streams of death energy that Bai Xiaochun's divine sense revealed to be innumerable evil ghosts. "Damn it, you know I'm afraid of ghosts. I can't believe you're trying to scare me." However, because of how close Gongsun Wan'er was to him, and how she was bound in place by all the magical symbols, he quickly pulled his hand back and then slapped her on her attractive rear end. A loud smacking sound rang out, and Gongsun Wan'er's expression distorted. As a result, the evil ghosts stopped in place. Meanwhile, true killing intent appeared in Gongsun Wan'er's eyes. Seeing that his strategy had been effective, Bai Xiaochun pulled his hand back again to deliver another blow. "Feeling suicidal, Bai Xiaochun?" she said furiously. However, how could Bai Xiaochun not take advantage of the fact that she was completely immobilized by his Sutra of Former Reincarnation? Therefore, he let swing another slap, and another, and another. After spanking her 10 times, Gongsun Wan'er's anger suddenly vanished, to be replaced by a somewhat dazed expression. That dazed look struck fear into Bai Xiaochun's heart. However, as soon as he stopped spanking her, the killing intent appeared in her eyes again, so he quickly struck her rear end again. And thus, she calmed down again. Soon, the dazed look turned into complete blankness, and she was even panting a bit. At that point, Bai Xiaochun was truly struck with fear. "Wan'er, can you do me a favor? Tomorrow, Find an opportunity to publicly announce that the reason you took over this prefecture is that the demigod preceptor Marquis Zilin has been secretly working for your Smile Emperor dynasty. Forget it, she said, the blank look in her eyes fading a bit. Feeling very anxious, Bai Xiaochun hardened his heart and spanked her another dozen or so times. By this point, she was starting to go a bit limp. In fact, without Bai Xiaochun holding her up, she would have just sagged down to the ground. Heart racing, Bai Xiaochun growled, agree? Or not? Panting for breath, Gongsun Wanner gritted her teeth and refused to speak. After spanking her some more, her eyes went almost completely blank. Finally, she hissed, fine, I agree, now get the hell out of here. As far as Bai Xiaochun was concerned, this interaction with Gongsun Wanner had been bizarre to the extreme. After finally getting her to agree, he quickly left her immortal's cave, feeling slightly guilty, but at the same time, almost in a bit of a daze. I can't believe Gongsun Wanner is so resilient, he muttered to himself, blinking a few times. For some reason, there was some sort of vile fire burning in his heart now, something he couldn't get rid of. Vixen, she just seduced me, didn't she? In the end, he could only sigh at how outstanding he was. Sometimes, he frightened even himself. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.